The next important category where we have to change our understanding has something to do with the strategy of self-exploration and the strategy of therapy. And this is an extremely important issue. The reason for this is that we have such a jungle, such an incredibly rich market of different schools of psychotherapy, including a group of them which all are subsumed under the term depth psychology and are really derived from Freudian psychoanalysis. And they all present very different perspectives on how the psyche functions, why the symptoms are there, what they mean, and each of them also offers a very different strategy. What do we do? They offer different techniques to work with their clients to fix them, to sort of change their psychological functioning so that it is normalized according to the perspective of that particular school. Now, if we have a problem, then we can just simply flip a coin and we can choose a school, and with each school there will be a different story or what's wrong with us, and will be offered a very different approach to achieve somehow alleviation of the symptoms. It's a very peculiar situation, which is in a way unique. We don't have 50 schools of chemistry where the chemists would argue, what happens when you put two substances into the test tube. And what's even stranger is that those of us who work in the profession, in psychology or in psychiatry, very frequently don't even question it, that there's something wrong here, something problematic. When we are beginning professionals, we simply look at this market and we feel attraction to one particular system. Like for me, it was Freudian analysis. And we get training in that particular system. If we are not satisfied with it, we just get training in another system which might have a very different set of assumptions. Now, the interesting thing here is that we don't have any statistical studies that would tell us that clearly one psychotherapeutic system is better than another. Those studies are not easy to do, and those studies that have been done discovered something very interesting, which is that in each school you find good therapists and bad therapists, therapists who have better results and worse results. But generally, the results of the therapies using verbal means are not terribly impressive in the first place, but within that range, there are sort of good therapists and bad therapists working with the same premises. And these studies have shown that very likely their results, the results they're getting, have very little to do with what they think they're doing, the techniques they are applying, the kind of interpretations they give, the timing of those interpretations, the content of those interpretations, because that varies radically from one school to another. So if there was a critical dependence on the conceptual understanding and on the use of the technique, this situation couldn't exist. So we see that there is something operating in these verbal forms of psychotherapy that very likely has very little to do with what the therapists think they are doing, with the theoretical concepts of their school. And there is something that is very difficult to formulate somehow scientifically. So some of the things that have been emphasized, for example, were things like the quality of the human encounter between the therapist and the client, the feeling of the client of being unconditionally accepted by another human being, or even the sense of being loved, that these could be the most important mechanisms that are operating here. So the interesting question is, what kind of insights do we get into this very unsatisfactory situation in psychotherapy when we work with non-ordinary states? Basically, what we find here confirms somehow something that Jung actually formulated. According to Jung, it is in principle impossible to use our intellect to understand the psyche of another person or even our own. The reason for this is that the intellect is just a partial function. For Jung, the psyche is something that is cosmic. He talks about anima mundi. So our individual psyche is kind of teased out of this much larger universal matrix. So the intellect is not equipped to understand the psyche, which is a much larger phenomenon than the intellect. So the alternative that Jung offers is, what we can do, we can somehow create a protective environment. And the Jungian psychology uses here the image of the hermetic vessel in which the alchemical transformation happens. We can offer a certain technique, which for Jung was the analysis of dreams and the active imagination, which was basically continuation of the dream from the night. And then we create a situation in which the conscious ego can get into a kind of a dialogue using symbolic means with a higher aspect of ourselves, which he called self with capital S, which is connected to the collective unconscious and has the kind of the wisdom of ages, which surpasses the knowledge of any individual therapist or any individual school. And so the healing happens under sort of guidance of the inner healing principle. Jung talked about the individuation process. The self has a certain plan for us. It's guiding us towards a certain goal if we let it. Now, this was very much confirmed in the work with non-ordinary states, where we again create a supportive environment. We offer a technique, one of the technologies of the sacred that I talked about, that would change the consciousness of the person. And in the holotropic state, then there's something like an inner radar which will find the areas in the psyche, the contents which have a strong emotional charge, will automatically bring them for processing, transform them into a conscious experience. And in this process, which is also guided by the inner healing intelligence, the symptoms will be consumed. So the task of the therapist then is to become a kind of intelligent co-player or co-adventurer, not somebody who is guiding the process in any way, but somebody who is intelligently supporting what's happening already. This is the original meaning of the Greek term therapeutes, which means somebody who assists in the healing process. And then we have the last category in which major changes have to happen. When we do this work with non-ordinary states, we'll encounter experiences and observations which cannot be accounted for as long as we adhere to the philosophy of Western science, to the materialistic, mechanistic model. And we need a new paradigm. We need a sort of fundamentally different understanding of reality, particularly in regard to the nature and function of consciousness. We cannot see any more consciousness as something that emerged as an accidental byproduct out of the complexity of the neurophysiological processes in the brain, but we start seeing it as a fundamental and primary, irreducible aspect of existence. And again, this is something that we will explore at some length in later sessions. At this point, I would like to look once more at the ancient and pre-industrial cultures, the native cultures on the one side, and the Western industrial civilization on the other. When we compare these two human groups, we'll see that they have a very different worldview. Obviously, modern science discovered many aspects of the micro world and the macro world that the native cultures, the ancient cultures, didn't know anything about. But that's not a major difference between those two worldviews. This is something that would be expected. This is something that comes with progress and accumulation of human knowledge. There is one difference which is much more astonishing, which is the difference concerning the spiritual dimension of reality. That for the native cultures has been very, very real, whereas for Western science, and in a sense for Western civilization in general, has been seriously questioned or even seen as non-existent. Now, this is usually attributed to the superiority of Western materialistic science. The spiritual vision of the world is interpreted so that these native cultures, the pre-industrial cultures, simply didn't know enough about the world, and they were afraid of death, they were afraid of impermanence, and this is why they created sort of a kind of wish-fulfilling system, this whole spiritual perspective. Now, when we look at it closer, we'll see that the reason is very, very different and has to do with the attitude to holotropic states of consciousness.